All right, good people. Welcome back to another wonderful session. It's nice to see everybody that's pulling back up in here, and I'm grateful to be here. Today, I want to continue off of where we left off last, which is talking about how do we connect the front end and the back end, right? We've spent a lot of time talking about the front end. We started talking a little bit about the back end, but today I wanted to make sure we had a very clear entry point into how do we connect those two, right? How do we move away now from having the ability to set up these React app pages and start the process of developing, in addition to those React app pages, a viable backend infrastructure that we can build off of, right? And so when we talk about front end and back end, we're talking about client side and server side programming, right? React was handling a lot of our client side operations, which is everything that the user who is making requests to a server would see. So anything from interactions on the website to the HTML that comes back would be client side. And on the server side, we would be handling those requests that the client makes to retrieve some data, right? And there's a number of different ways we can make those requests, but the server is responsible for listening to requests that a client makes and suggests data to return back to that client. And we've gotten a good entry point to all things front end, all things client side so far, but turning into the back end is a little bit of a different process, requiring a little bit different code. I shouldn't say more. There's a good amount on both sides, but on the back end now, we're working with a completely different set of code in order to create that infrastructure. So today, I want to kind of dive back into that, make sure that we leave the day having a complete full stack little application that shows the client side connected to the server side and front end connected to the back end. So if you're ready to rock with me on that, just give me a thumbs up so I know y'all rocking with me, and we will make it happen. Yes, yeah. Welcome back. Yeah. Cool. So we started working on a project that was the WhatsApp kind of clone, right, with different messages. And I can show y'all that real quick just to give us a recap of what that looked like. Right, we had this nice little dashboard and some messages, and what we were building before we broke last time was the ability to have these messages come back from the server. So if you see, I have some of these messages coming back from the server now. There was a super small bug that I had in the code last time that prevented us from seeing it. But the good news is that now we know what to do, and we're going to recreate a similar setup by connecting a front-end application to the server. Just to kind of give you context, right? So you see these three messages here. In our front-end code that we've been working with, we built some components that essentially built out each of these messages. And what we were working on last was trying to get the server to send these messages back to our React application. So if I were to go and take a look at the server that we created, just real quick, you could see that we had this API route called messages that was sending over an array of some kind with a couple different messages. Hello from the server, let's get things connected, express to React were those three messages. If I go back, clearly, as you can see, those were the same three messages that appear here on our application. So clearly the data is coming back from the server, which is great. So rather than dive into a lot of code that, you know, is kind of maybe a little bit doing a lot more than it needs to, I figure let's start from scratch, create a new application that's doing something very similar, and then we can take a look back at this code and see how we might be able to add this, how we added this logic to this existing application. So what I want to do is just kind of start a new project. And so in order to do that, first thing I'm going to do is make sure I go back to this VS Code window first and just close out of the running application. Then next thing I want to do is I'm just going to close these because I don't need them right now. This was the server that I had created first, so I'll stop this as well and close this. And we're going to start from scratch. We're going to just kind of start from the beginning Now that I stopped those servers, if I were to rerun this, clearly localhost 3000 is not running because I just stopped that server. So we'll get back to the point where we get our front end up. First, let's start the process of creating the infrastructure that we need in order to build this application as a full stack application, including client side and server side stuff. So first, I want to start with the backend, right? And that's just a little bit different of an approach than what we're used to. And I'll explain why that's important in a second. First thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to open a new window in VS Code. And in this new window, I'm going to start a new project. And, you know, when my computer allows me to start a new project, I'm going to start a new project sometime. But like I said, we're kind of starting this project out a little bit different than we have with our Create React app. And the reason why is because Create React app was helping us start the front end, right? But if we're starting with a back end, we kind of have to do a little bit of a different approach. For me, I love making sure my files stay organized. So I have this little trick of just opening a folder and starting my code in a new folder so that everything stays kind of organized and all in the same place. So what I'm going to do is just go to my projects folder where I save all my new projects. And I'm just going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it React Express. And so I have this new folder in here, and I'm just going to click open. And the reason I like to do this is because hopefully if everything works well, it should open this new folder and create a new terminal inside of that folder for me. So all the things I need are readily available. So let me just go ahead, open a new terminal, just to make sure that that's the case. And look, cool, we're in the React Express folder, ignore these updates, and that's great. So I'll just drag this terminal up because there's a couple things we got to do in here first. So when we're working on the back end, especially in JavaScript, right? We're going to be creating what we call node projects. And a node project is basically just a project that's using Node as the engine for running the project. And essentially Node comes built in with a couple of different libraries and tools, command scripts that we can use in order to libraries, tools, commands, etc., to allow for us to essentially create our projects. I just saw the chat. Just give me a thumbs up if you can see my VS Code window. That's all I need to be able to see real quick.
Yes.
You see it. All right, cool. Thanks. All right, awesome. So basically, anything that's using Node as a project is basically going to be able to utilize some of Node's pre-built-in commands and tools for starting your projects. And we use Node to run JavaScript projects. So if you're not building a regular HTML website that is connected to JavaScript and then you run the JavaScript in the browser, you use Node to run the JavaScript everywhere else. So Node is one of those libraries that is essential to JavaScript programming. On the back end, it's even more important because on the back end, there is no HTML that you're connecting your code to per se, right? So what we use Node for in the back end is for connecting all of our packages that we will use in JavaScript in order to run the code that we want to run. And so Node is not necessarily, I see somebody ask, is Node a VM? It's not necessarily a VM, it's a package. It's a tool that allows us to manage packages in JavaScript and execute JavaScript code. So it's just almost like, it's not a compiler, but it's a tool that we use to run the JavaScript code. Let's think about it that way. So what we want to do is start a new backend project using Node. And the key here is anytime you want to create a new Node project, all you need to do is have a folder open where you're going to say, hey, I'm going to initialize this project to use Node. So clearly the folder that I'm using is this React Express folder that I just created. And now that I'm in the terminal in the same location as that folder, I can run some commands to put Node into this project and initialize this project with Node. So what I'm going to do is going to run a command called npm, right? And npm is essentially the Node package manager. It's a command that comes pre-built into Node that allows us to interact with packages, but also to set up Node projects for the first time. So the command I want to run is npm init. And npm init is going to run a couple of different scripts that ask me some simple questions about my project, like the entry point, the names of certain files, and a couple little default things that allow you to set up your package. Now, if you could run npm init and by pressing enter through the wizard, right, it will set you up for creating this project, right? So it says certain things like package manager, package name, right? If I were to say enter, right, version, enter, description, enter, entry point, index.js, this is basically saying what is the file that is going to represent, that this is going to be like our main file in this project. I could say enter here, test command, enter, get repository. I don't really need one right now. Enter, 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 and it says okay, you can say yes. Now, if you're the type of person that you're like, okay, when I set up a Node project, if I want all the defaults and I don't want to have to keep pressing enter through all these things, or maybe you're creating a Node project in a, you know, in a developer environment, meaning like instead of you being here to press enter all the way, you might need to particularly automate some of this. There's another command you could use. You could say npm init -y, and this will just run through the same script of defaulted questions. It will select everything as the default, and then, you know, at the end where it says, is this okay? Yes. The -y flag basically puts that yes in there for you. So if you didn't want to go through the process of doing that yourself, you could just run the npm init -y to have that handle that for you. But after you do the package, after you run npm init, whether you use the -y flag or not, you're going to end up with this package.json file. And the package.json file is a file that we use to keep track of all of our apps, dependencies, any of the project files that we need, essentially any of the packages that we use within our project. We will keep track of them here, as well as any scripts that we define that we want to use in order to automate certain tasks using Node, right? So one of the first scripts that got created was this test script that basically just prints to the command line, hey, you don't have a test specified. So we can create as many different scripts as we want. This is a really popular reason why folks use Node, to create these scripts that you can use to make your process of development easier. But also, once we start installing packages, the package.json is the point central for all things related to this Node project. So now that we have a package.json, we can say that we're created a Node project. So this is important for y'all who are aspiring full stack devs, especially folks looking to code in JavaScript. Whenever you look at a folder and you see a package.json, you can guarantee that project is using Node. And chances are you're going to need Node on your computer in order to run that project effectively and create things within your own space. So the package.json is an essential file for us, and we're going to use it in our server specifically for creating the packages that we need, hosting all the packages that we need in order to just try to minimize some of these things. It's annoying. My bad, y'all. My eyes getting distracted. Cool. So we're going to use the package.json to manage all of our dependencies necessary for creating our server and making those different, making the different files ready that we're going to need to launch this server essentially. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to make use of a package in Node called Express. And Express is essentially a library that we can use for creating REST APIs and servers utilizing Node and it's a very popular choice for when you're creating backend servers in JavaScript. But much like any other server routing library, it does similar things to other libraries that you could use for creating servers and across different languages. So what you see happening in Express is typically done in other, you can find done in other packages as well, whether you're using JavaScript or not, right? The idea of how to create the server is unique to JavaScript, which is why we use Express in a JavaScript project. But if you're working in Python and you were using something like Flask to build your server, you'll see a lot of the logic is similar between what you're doing in Express, what you have to define, as well as what you would do if you're working in Python and Flask or something like that. So it's good to know at least one server-side library so that you can build servers of your own in the language of your choice. But cool, so now that we have this package.json, what I want to do is I want to install Express. And this is going to bring in the Express library and create a new folder in this project called Node Modules that's going to hold Express, but also any of the other dependencies that Express needs in order to work, right? So Express, like any other package, might rely on other packages. And so our Node Modules folder is going to hold all of those packages for us so that all of that is good. So now that we have Express in our project, the only thing we need to do now in order to start being able to run something is we need to create a entry point for our server to essentially get launched. So what I want to do is, just to make the code a little bit cleaner for what we're going to do later, I'm just going to create a new folder in this folder that we started. I'm going to call it server. And inside of that server folder, I'm going to create a new file. And that will be where I put the index.js. That is our server's index.js file. So essentially, this index.js file for our server is where we're going to define all of the necessary components to have our Express server get launched. And if you remember what we did last time, all of this is probably going to be real familiar. But if you're looking at this for the first time, hopefully you see that it's not as OD of a process as you might think. So what we're going to do is start our Express logic out by requiring in Express as a into our code. So there's two ways of doing imports and exports with JavaScript. Typically on the client side, where we're doing things like create React app and all the stuff we're used to, we use the import X from blank syntax. So it would look like import, maybe we did like import use state. Sorry, all my computer's bugging. Import use state from like React, right? So this was the import syntax that we're used to when we were working with in the client side. And the reason that we could use this syntax is due to a version of JavaScript that supports this, right? When we're working on the server side, typically you're going to see a different import syntax used on the server side that you just want to get familiar with. Both are doing the same thing. They just have different syntax. On the server side, which we're working in right now, rather than do import X from Y, you see const with the name of the package. So in this case, it'd be Express, and then require. And then in the requires parentheses, you'll put the string of the package that you're requiring in. So for me, I'll put Express. And this would be the same as essentially saying import Express from Express. But on the server side, typically, this is the syntax that you'll see for importing Express into our project. Dope. So the next thing I got to do is I need to define a port for our server to run. So essentially, a port is going to be a specific address on our machine that is going to be open up for traffic, web traffic. So essentially, you could think of it like port is a different channel on our machine that has the ability for web traffic to interact with it. And we can define ports on our machine that say, hey, you know, if somebody goes to this particular channel on our machine, they can see this particular thing, this particular running instance. And when we're building applications, especially web applications, the port that those applications run on is very important because certain applications tend to use certain ports. And it's important to just kind of standardize your process for what ports you open up for what, right? And as you start working in more full stack applications, certain databases will default to a certain port, and you know, certain servers will use certain things. And the networking of that can be reconfigured. You can always change those things, but it's just important to know that some particular applications run on specific ports. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a port for our server to run on a port that is not going to be in use right now, right? And so we know with React, we were running our React code on localhost 3000. We could continue to work with localhost 3000, but because we're going to end up creating a React app at some point, it's probably good for us to create a new port on a different location. So I'm just going to go ahead and just set this to be 8000 because 8000 just, there's not a lot of things that come top of mind that say that they're going to use port 8000. And if there is at some point, you know, we can always change this later to be something different. I could use 3001, you know, I could use whatever number I really want here, so long as it doesn't conflict with another application running on another port, right? So that's really it. If you don't have any applications running on specific ports, then you could pretty much choose a port number yourself. But sometimes when you run specific applications, you'll find that those ports might already be in use. So just to be safe, we'll set a pretty high number of 8000 and let that be. The next thing we want to do is we want to initialize an Express application. And basically an Express is simultaneously a library, but also a function that we can call that creates all of the necessary configuration we need to launch a server in JavaScript. So what we're going to do now is just kind of create a new app variable. I'm using constants here just because I don't expect these values to change ever. But I could use the let keyword if I wanted to as well. But I'm just going to go ahead, create this Express application. And now the last thing you need to do in order to have your application live and ready to go is you need to have your app listen to a certain port and listen to traffic on a certain port. So what we're going to do is start app port. So what we're going to do here is just say app.listen, which is takes in a couple of parameters. It takes in our port. So we're going to pass the port number in there. And it also takes in a callback function that will get called whenever this application starts listening, is open up and listening to traffic. So we'll say console.log, and this writes something like server. I'll try to get rid of this pop-up for y'all. Server is listening on, and so we can say, let's just say port, and then bring in that port variable in here so that we can see that it's on there. Cool. So we just made a little templated string. If you're not familiar with this syntax, if we use backticks, which are the little symbol underneath the tilde or underneath your escape key, you can create and pass JavaScript variables into your strings using this backtick syntax, which is really helpful, especially here where I wanted to pass that data into the string. All right, so cool. So we imported Express, defined a port for the server to run on, initialize the application, and we're going to start the app at that particular port. If you remember, this is just a JavaScript file, so essentially it's going to run line by line by line, kind of just following the order of the statements in the file. So the last thing that's going to run is this app.listen when we finally run this code. So cool. Now that we have this, let me just save it real quick and yeah, and we're good. So what we're gonna do is after this finishes kind of saving on my side, pardon all my my little VS Code modules. But once this is saved, right, if I want to run this particular code, I could do that by just saying node, and then I have to pass a particular path to a JavaScript file, right? So clearly, right now, and where I am, I'm inside of the top level folder. So I'd have to go into server and then index.js in order to run this file. So that would look like something like this, right? And if I were to run this, as you can see, I get back that message that says our server is listening on port 8000, which is great. So this is cool. So now anytime I want to run the project, right, I can run this command node server blah 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 and have that run that port, right? One thing that's real cool about the package.json file though is that you can leverage it to create scripts to make your development process a little bit easier. So one thing we can do is define a new script in here to make it so that we can start our project in a different way than having to just specify node server / index.js. You could imagine maybe if the file I wanted to run was nested, or there's other situations where maybe it's not as practical for me to just keep saying node server / index.js, right? I could create a new script in here and can give it any kind of name I want. So I'll just say start for now. So when I say start, I want a particular script to run. And in this, I can write the same script here. So I can just say node server / index.js, right? Put a little comma here so that this doesn't yell at me. And dope. So now that I have this defined in the package.json, this new script, I can run npm start, right? And achieve the same effect of getting the application started. So if you remember, when we use React, right, we actually use npm start as a command in order to start our React projects. And this is how, right? In the create React app template, start is a script defined already by create React app, and it runs some specific React scripts that launch our development server and everything just by us saying npm start. Well, now we have kind of similar workflow for our server, where if wherever we say npm start, we'll get our server running on port 8000. Cool. So just a quick show of thumbs, make sure everybody's rocking with me. If everything we're doing so far makes sense to you, just give me a thumbs up so I know that we're all in the same place. Gucci, groovy, cool. Can we crack double digits? Got 9. Can I crack double digits? But you know what I'm saying? You would so all right, cool. So we're starting the server. We have everything kind of going. We have Express in our application. We even have our index.js with our servers defined. So now to really kind of create this backend to make it so that we're in a good position to get the rest of our code together. What I want to do is, and this is realistically what you're going to be working on the back end all the time, is we got to start defining some routes for our server to hit. So essentially, the routes technically become what is the application listening for clients to request, right? So remember, a client is going to say, hey, I know there's this server running on port 8000. I want to get some data, or I want to post some data. I want to delete some data, right? And so in order for the client to do that, we need to give it specific routes that it can use in order to interact with our server. So in order to do that, right, all we got to do is define some routes. right? And here, like defining routes is a pretty simple process, but it gets complicated by way of you determining what is it that you want those routes to do when a client requests them, right? So if you remember, there's a couple of different HTTP methods. I'll just type them here right now. So, right, there's a couple of different HTTP methods. Let me just do it as an array so that this doesn't scream at me while I do this whole time, right? So we have get, right? We have post, we have put, there's patch, I believe, as well, and delete, right? And these are HTTP methods that essentially, when a client is making a request to our server, it will utilize one of these methods in order to get the data, in order to retrieve the data, let's say. I don't want to use the word get, retrieve the data, right? So when we create a route, we define the route based on one of these methods and then a callback function for when this route with this particular method gets called, what are we going to respond with, right? So as you can see in a second, we're going to create a route that is fairly simple in order to kind of demonstrate the point. And then maybe if we have some time toward the end, we'll add some more. So right now, what we'll do is, let's say what we want to have happen here is that whenever we'll have our server basically kind of define a message that will get shown on our client side eventually, right? The client will pull the message and use this server as an API to pull some messages and essentially show it on the client side. For now, we'll start with one message, but over time, as you might see how we might extend the logic here to then send back multiple messages. So here's what we're going to do. So we're going to define our first route, and this is going to be an endpoint in our API for our server. So remember, an API is an application programming interface, which essentially just is a bridge between two running applications. Right now, our Express app is running on port 8000. Later, our client-side application will be running on port 3000. And by defining this API using Express, we're going to create a bridge where the client can access the data from the server utilizing the routes that we're defining. So let's create our first route. And in order to do that, we're gonna need to make use of the Express app that we created. So we're gonna say app dot when it decides to go, when it decides to go, you know what I'm saying? there it is. All right, app.get, right? And remember, we're using this .get is one of those HTTP methods to basically say, hey, if the client is saying they want to get some data, we can run this particular method. Now, whenever you define a route, there's a couple parameters that you need to give it, right? The first is, what HTTP method are we going to use, right? Are we going to be using get, put, patch, delete? Which method are we using, right? So that's one of the first things we have to define. The second thing we need to define is the path that route is going to be retrieved on. Essentially, the path would be the equivalent to the URL that you would be tacking on to the end of your route, to the end of your domain in order to get the data, right? So if our server is, when our server is running, right, we got to specify what route am I trying to hit? And the way we specify that route is with a path. So right now I can say, you can give the path anything that you want to name it. This would be the default route. So like when you first make a request to this particular server, this route would be the path that gets called first. But as you add to the path, that would be other information that someone would have to add to the server's domain name or to the server's IP address, essentially, in order to get that data. So for example, or for instance, I was trying to say both of those words at the same time. For instance, if I want to have this be a route for our API, maybe, we could just say something like /API, right? And this means that if somebody were to go to /API on our server and specifically making a GET request, they will be triggering the route we're defining right now. So first thing is, what is the HTTP method that we're calling? Second thing is, what is the path of the route? And then the third thing is, we need to pass a callback function that will get triggered when that route gets called. So this, as you can see, is just an arrow function. So inside of here is just some code to do something when client requests this route. So this is where we can write all of our code, right, that we want to do. But in order for the route to fully make use of the request and response lifecycle that happens in HTTP requests, we need to pass two very special parameters into our callback function so we can make use of them in the process of doing something, right? Those are a request and a response object. So we could say request and response. And essentially, the request object is just an object that gets passed into this callback function that has all of the data on the request that a client made. The response is another object that has methods and different data that we can use when we're making a response back to the client. So you need to pass these two objects into your callback functions in this order. It's always request first, response second. What you might see is, instead of people spelling out request and response all the way, you might see something like this where people do rec and res, but it's the same thing. You can name these whatever, but for your own sake and readability, you're going to want to make sure that it's named something related to request response, so it's easy to see what's going on there. And now that we have those two things in there, if I wanted to check anything about the client's request, I could use this request object. But more specifically for what we want to do, instead of just do something when the client handles this this route, I'm going to say send message back to client, right? And so in order to do that, I'm going to make use of the response object, which has a number of different functions and properties on it, as you can see here, that we can call, right? One of the ones that is very important to know is like responses send data. So there's a number of different send data type functions that you can call. You can do res.send, which then you can specify some data. You can send files. You can do all these really interesting things. Another one that's like not as clear that it's just sending data, but is pretty widely used, especially when you're working in JavaScript or when you're building these full stack applications, making use of data from the server, is the JSON function, which basically the res.json function, excuse me, y'all, they doing something outside of the door here. Sorry to be mad loud. But the res.json function allows us to send JSON data as a response. So JSON data, if you recall, is basically data that is already formatted in JavaScript. So by sending JSON data, it makes it very easy for us to work with JavaScript applications because we're passing the data already in a format that JavaScript understands. So we can pass data types that JavaScript is already familiar with: strings, Booleans, numbers, arrays, objects, right? And by utilizing those particular data types, a JavaScript front-end application can just very easily start manipulating that data. Other applications running in different code languages would have to convert that JSON somehow into the language data types of that particular language, which is another reason why typically when you see folks work in full stack applications and they use Node or something like that, they might build their front end utilizing JavaScript because of just ease of maneuvering with that data. But you can see here from an example of the JSON, different types of JSON that were being sent over, right? So they were sending over null objects. So this is an object that has no value. This is an actual object where the username key is TJ. This is a JSON where they're sending just a string, but they're also passing a status code with it. And so as you can see, you can change some methods in the response as well. So remember 500 level status codes are typically status codes we can send from the server if something goes wrong, which is why they put this oh no's in here. And then 400 level status codes are for when the client is making a bad request. And you can say something like, hey, I don't have that resource or whatnot. But for us, we can use this res.json method in order to send back some data from the server's API to the client. And so what we're going to do is send an object, and the object is going to be have a key called message and some data called that we just kind of defined, right? So we're going to say yo from the server. And cool. So with this res.json, we should be able to send this data pretty simply down. And even before that, we can almost test it out a little bit on our browser. So let's do that real quick and just see what comes back in the browser when we make a request here. So in order to do this, one thing to keep in mind, like we talked about last time, is whenever you make a change in your server-side code, you're going to need to stop the server and restart it in order to see that change. So I just stopped it. I ran npm start again because we put that script in there. And so now I should be able to see those changes. So I'm going to not go to localhost 3000 just yet, but I'll go to localhost 8000. And okay, cannot get so this error is actually good, right? So cannot get / right is basically saying that, hey, there's no route for this particular path. So remember, this path is the path where you don't specify anything after the domain or after the IP address is considered the root route, and that route we didn't actually add anything there, right? If I wanted to fix this error, I could add a new route real quick for that particular path, just to make sure that I remind myself, hey, that's not the route you tested right now. So just go here. Whoops. Same thing, right? Create the callback function for the route. And then in here, I can just say res. I could do another res.json, or just like I could do a res.send also, just to kind of show y'all different methods, and just say, hey, don't forget we're testing route /API. Dope. So remember, I made a change here, so I got to stop the server, start it back up, and now that should be running. And so if I refresh this, okay, cool. So now it said, hey, don't forget we're testing route /API. But clearly this is coming back from our server, so big win for us, right? First route, boom. So because we're not really testing this route, we're testing /API. I'm going to add /API to the end of this, right? And this is what the routes do, right? You add the route to your particular server's domain so that you can make that particular request to that route. So when I go to /API, cool, we see that we get that, I know it's super small, but you see we get that object back that has the message yo from the server. Cool. That's making sense to y'all and you're following along, just give me a thumbs up, just so I know that we in the same place. Groovy. Thanks, y'all. Appreciate your time and your attention. Dope. Okay, cool. So we're kind of good here on what we need for the server in order to have the routes work. So if I go back to VS Code real quick, I just want to point out one really important thing, which is, as you can see, I'm putting all of the routes above this line that says listen, because anything after this app.listen isn't going to be run by the app when it's live, right? So it's important just to have the routes defined prior to actually doing the app.listen so that we can actually see those routes on in the development, right? But now you can see here's an example of a server that has 2 routes, right? And so hopefully you can imagine if you were to add more routes, what that would look like. And if I were to tell you, hey, we're going to actually make some routes with different HTTP methods, you might be able to assume how might you change these routes. If I said, hey, instead of app.get/API, it's app.post, right? You might think about how you might refactor some of these routes to utilize those different HTTP methods. Cool. So we can see our message. We're good. Now, I just want to kind of change gears and start talking about how are we going to connect this to our front end. Some folks are asking, how do you end the server? I stop the server. Great timing because we're going to need to do that anyway. You can do Control-C to stop the server. And the next thing we want to do now that we've stopped this server is we're going to actually, we want to create a bit of code for our front end. And like I said, I'm trying to do this all from scratch in order to make it so that the code is a bit more, basically make it so that our code is a bit more consolidated as a full stack application, right? So we have clearly this server, this file, this folder called server that has our servers index.js in there. The next thing I want to do is actually create our front end as the client side code in this same project, right? So you might be wondering, why am I going to do this? Well, sometimes, right, we're going to need to have a front end on our server so that the server can say, hey, if you go to the default route, right, we're going to actually want you to see our client side application or something, right? So there's certain cases where you always are going to need a server in order to show your client side code. Every client side application needs some server to host the files at least. So we can just make use of this server that we're building to also do that. But at the same time, I also just need a client-side application so we can test some of these API requests and get some information sending from client to server. So what I'm going to do is inside of the React Express folder that I started. So remember, this is my main project folder. I'm going to do like I would have done if I were making another a React project in the first place, right? Is run the create React app toolchain. So create React app, npx create React app, right? And then I can give this app a name for it to create a folder for me, right? With that React code inside of it, right? Give me a thumbs up, you know what I'm talking about, right? When I run npx create React app, if I say, homework 5 or whatever, right? It's going to create a folder for me called homework 5 with all my information in it, right? Y'all know this. We've done this a bunch of times, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new React app, but I'm going to call it client, right? So this is going to run this script and it's going to create a client folder for me that is going to contain all of that create React app starter code that I need in order to realistically host all of that that development code. So you can see that client folder got created, and now my computer is going to take that time to set up all those scripts that the create React app toolchain uses in order to stand up our React project, right? And the reason we're doing this is because I just want a React application that I can use to start testing out some things related to this server that we started. But then secondly, as we'll see toward the end, I'm going to utilize this client folder as in order to also demonstrate how would we host this code on a server, specifically this server that we created a couple minutes ago. So don't mind. I I apologize for the time it's taking a little bit. You know what I'm saying? We got 5 different big apps doing a lot of things at the same time, and we just doing what we're doing. But Yeah, so y'all know the vibes. This is gonna do its thing, creating the necessary files in the React code base. But and while it's doing that, what I'd love to do actually is just kind of take a look at the Express documentation, because there is pretty good information in there about a lot of the things that we're doing here that you might want to just further unpack for yourself, right? So if you're just looking for more understanding of how to use Express, clearly you can come to the Express.js website and then go through the Getting Started guide, which is really helpful in just giving you all of that information that we were doing previously about how to set up Express, but then also how to create our first route, right? So here it is again, just creating our first route. This route they called Hello World, right? So what I wanted to show you was how let's go to basic routing. Just so we can see, like I was talking about with the ways that routes get defined, right? So if you create a new Express application, the application would have a HTTP method passed into it with a path and then a callback function or an event, a handler for when that route gets called, right? So clearly you can see some differences here. And this is what I wanted to show you, right? So if we were making a GET request to a specific route, right, then this would be the format for making that GET request at a route, at the default route, right, the root route. If we were to make a post request, right, we could do a similar structure, but the biggest thing that changes is the app.get turns into an app.post, right? And now we're able to make a post request, right? As you can see, these are still utilizing the same path, but that's okay because they're doing different methods. So you can have a route that has the same path, but it won't give you an issue unless you are making two of the same HTTP methods. So long as you're using different HTTP methods in your route, you can use the same path to specify that route. Remember, GET requests are typically used when you're telling a server, hey, I just want to get some data, right? Post requests are typically used when we're passing data into a server to utilize. So we're like sending data to the server. Put requests are similar where you're passing data into the server as well. Delete requests, typically you're saying, you're telling the server from the client, hey, I want to delete some data. Just wanted to show you this as it relates to the different types of routes that you might be able to create and express utilizing your the server that you created and the routes that you might need to define. Cool. Let's go back here. I think this is probably close to done, hopefully. But some other stuff that's in here that is helpful. This thing about static files, which we're actually going to make use of in a bit, talks about how would you add files into your server that you might want to return in those routes as well, right? So you can use this method for to create static files. You can also turn whole directories into static content that can be served up, meaning that if somebody were to go to these particular URLs in your server, they'll be able to see those files publicly as well. So this is a big part of why you use servers, is because you might have resources on the server that you want people to access. And in order to allow people to access those particular resources, you need to make them available using your server. So the static method in Express is useful here. Sometimes you need to utilize paths to those resources. So there's a structure here for utilizing a specific path to make specific resources public. Cool.
Hey, Professor.
So yeah, and this talks about how sometimes the path might be relative to what directory you're in. So if you have to choose a different directory, you might have to add some other parameters to that same request to make those resources static. And we'll see an example of this toward the end of our class today. All right, I think that's probably, we good here, hopefully.
Hey, Professor.
Gosh.
Hello?
All right. I can tell. I feel it. I can feel it coming in the air tonight. Oh yeah. Yeah, yo. Take this moment to say,
hello.
Computer, Cam. You know what I'm saying?
Hello.
Professor.
I be holding on about stuff. You know what I'm saying? I be holding on about computer. OD. But yeah, you know the vibes. I can't really do much about that for y'all real quick. But there we go. Cool. So now we have this client side folder. We're good to go, right? So in the client side application, we have everything that we would normally expect out of a React application, right? So we got the source folder, we got our app.js, our components are in here, right? We're good to go. So all I want to do is start to make some changes, and that will allow for us to pull some of this data down from the app.js, pull some of the data down from our server into our React code. So first things first, let's just follow this and just like launch the development server. So I'm going to cd into the client and an npm start, and this should just launch our development environment. So localhost 3000. And once that finally runs, this should reload for me and show us the money, show us the React money. That's what we want to see. Oh yeah, and this, I could take a moment real quick to show you what I was saying before, right? Which is that when we run React apps, right, you can see that they also have a package.json. And in that package.json, right, there's all those dependencies that we're using, but then you see the scripts are here as well. So there's a start script in React that we use. And when we do npm start, that's what this npm start command is running for us. So cool. So now this is going ahead. Oh, my bad, bro. I can't hear y'all at all. No, I don't hear anything coming from the audio.
Can you hear me or no?
That might be because of the where the audio output is coming from. Can you type your question? Because I don't know if my audio.
Yeah, type your question then.
I can read the chat. I can't hear y'all. No, I'm sorry. What standard practice for file structure would be, specifically in the full stack space, I would say like it really depends. There's different libraries, different packages will utilize different kind of file structures, but the structure that you're seeing me create right now, I would say is pretty standard, right? If you have a server, you could see folks creating a server with an Express app and a client side folder inside of it. So yeah, this example that you're seeing is a pretty standard design pattern, but it really depends on the architectural choices that a team might use for how they are hosting their front end code. There's a number of different ways to host the code for your front end. So sometimes you see people putting their client side code in a separate folder. And in that way, you can, in that regard, you could not have it all nested. So sometimes teams don't nest all of their files. But to what you're saying, we created a parent folder and we do have two folders in it. That's kind of what's going on here if you look at this. So the parent folder is the React Express app that we created. But that parent folder just has two folders inside of it, a client and a server. The server one is where the API is. The client is where the React is. So yeah, the Express app is really only living inside of the index.js where we call Express. But what we did do is we started a node project in the root route. The reason we did this is just so that we can run scripts from the parent folder that would be able to reach both of these folders. So technically we did do this structure you're talking about, parent folder with 2 folders inside of it. If that makes sense. Node installed in the root is ideal. It really depends on what you're doing, bro. Like, I think in this case, it's fine because we're just running some scripts that are going to, we're running some scripts. We wanted to install Node in the project at the root so that we could launch the server and launch the API. You're gonna need something in the root to, otherwise you just kind of have 2 separate folders, which there's no real connection to it. So I would say, yeah, it's fine in this, and this is typical. And if you build a project where you have your client and your server in the same project, it would be typical for you to do it like this, where you create your server, you create your root route holding node, and then your packages and whatnot, and then you have these different folders for the other parts of your code. But again, it really depends on the team, how folks structure it at the beginning. How folks structure it determines what scripts you might need to call to run your server, for instance, right? I've seen folks do it the other way, where they have the client and then the server code on a different thing, right? So there's no like one way. I think that's important to say, but the way we're doing here is pretty standard. You'll see this kind of throughout the process. I think the reason I can't hear y'all actually is because of how my computer's set up right now. But yeah, if you got questions, definitely send it in the chat. My bad. But yeah, that's a good question, James. Cool. So I'm gonna keep going just for the interest of time. So we created this React application called client, right? And then the client application, like I mentioned, this is just a regular React app, right? So if we go to localhost 3000, because I ran that, I changed into that directory and ran npm start, you can see that in this, you can see that in this localhost 3000, we're clearly able to run our code, right? So the next things we want to do is we want to just make it so that we can connect this application to our server, right? And get the data back from our server. So in order to do this, right, we're going to need to make use of a couple different, there's a couple different things we got to do in order to connect the localhost 3000 development server to the localhost 8000 API server. And the thing is that when you start working in the front end and creating these full stack applications now that are going to rely on you getting data to a specific route, there's a particular tricky thing that comes up with relationship to working with these localhost development servers. Well, it comes up when you're working with servers in general. I shouldn't say only with your localhost. And this deals with what is called cross-origin resource sharing, which is called CORS. Cross-origin resource sharing basically is a security issue that means that browsers by default don't allow for you to share resources across different hosts, right? So one server running is on one origin, and the other another server running on a different origin would be basically those resources sharing across those origins. By default, browsers block that behavior for security purposes. And so essentially, if we wanted to make it so that our server can access the data across in order to allow for our data to access the server, in order for our server to access the data from the other server, we have to make sure that our server side routes are utilizing practices that will allow for that cross-origin resource sharing protocols to be to not be being infringed upon. CORS is a pretty complicated thing to talk about, but it's an area you're going to get all the time when you're working with servers and getting back data. So first, what I want to show is kind of how it happens, and then and so to kind of simulate the error first, and if we simulate it, then I'll show you what I mean by, hey, this is the error, and then from that, right, we'll see kind of what we got to do to fix it. So, all right, so here's what we're gonna do. So we got this React app working, right? So what I'm gonna do now, I'm gonna close the stuff for the server for now, close this other stuff, and let's just pretend like we're working on a completely React only app, right? So I'm just gonna focus now in the client. So to keep it simple, I'm just gonna work with one component. We're just gonna work with the app.js, and we're going to start the process of making our API requests, right? And so in order to start making requests to different servers, we need to make use of some JavaScript libraries that allow for asynchronous programming. There's a really dope one that's built into JavaScript called Fetch, but there's other libraries that you might npm install into your project so that you can use those other libraries. But for now, we're gonna use the default functions that are provided in JavaScript. So basically what I wanna do is I wanna make an API call. So I'm gonna just create a function for myself to do that. And I'm gonna just say, let's see. All right, I'm not gonna do okay. I'm gonna create a function for it, but I wanna do it in a way that just for time will make sense in the long run. In order to make an API request in the React code base, right? Especially in these like functional components that we got set up from the jump. We're gonna need to make use of an important hook in React that allows us to call certain code in particular moments when the application is, when the component is being rendered. So essentially, typically when you're making requests to servers in React, you're gonna make use of a particular hook that is useful for essentially notifying your code when the component is ready for you to make those requests, for lack of better words. The hook we're going to use is the use effect hook, which is a hook that comes built into the React library. So I'm just going to go ahead and import it in. And as you can see, right, we're using that import from syntax because we're back on the client side here. And what I want to do is essentially perform this API request, right? So the way we do that is we're going to call the use effects function, which is a function that takes in a callback function of its own. And basically within the use effect hook, you define a function to be called when certain data gets changed, right? If certain data gets changed. So here in this use effect, I want to essentially perform my API request, right? And this is going to be important because after I perform this API request, I just want to see if we can get data from the server. So essentially, I'm just doing this now to see if we can get data back from the server from our client application. So in order to perform an API request, you're going to need to use the fetch library. So we're going to use fetch to get our data, right? So the fetch library is the library that's pre-built into JavaScript. So you could just call fetch, and fetch is a function that takes in some information about the particular request you want to make. So if you are trying to, let's just take a look at the fetch library kind of documentation, just so I can show y'all in a little bit more detail about it. So yeah, we'll go to the Mozilla web docs on fetch. But yeah, so the fetch request takes in a string URL, right? That is the URL where you're going to perform your API request, right? Once you make that request, it comes back as data that then you can turn into, then you can manipulate utilizing JavaScript and some of the different values and functions that are built into fetch. The way that the fetch request works is you can pass a lot more sophisticated information into a fetch request. If you pass a fetch request with just a URL, it's going to assume that you're making a GET request, right? But if you were going to try to make a more specific request that's not a GET request, you have to pass some other information into the fetch request that you're calling, particularly the method, right? So if you know you're making a post request, you might need to pass this method data into your fetch call in order to let the fetch know, hey, we're actually making a post request. But here you can see a lot of the different types of metadata that you can pass into a fetch request, right? Some of the data that probably is most important for y'all right now would be the method, right? Clearly the method. We'll talk about the course drawn in a second. Headers are important because sometimes when you're making a request to a specific server, it will tell you, or even a specific API, it might tell you, hey, you have to use these particular headers. And then the body is really important when you're passing data into a request as well. So here in this fetch request, they're making a post request with a lot of other kind of flags. But one thing that's worth noting is that they're passing this body of data. And they're saying that the data should match the content type. So because the data they're passing is JSON, they made the header for the content type to say that they're passing JSON. These are just important nuances to working with servers and making API requests. One dope tool that makes it easier for you to kind of see how you need to call data when you're working with APIs is Postman. If any of y'all have heard of Postman, it's a great tool for leveraging when you're trying to test APIs and make API calls and whatnot. We might take a look at it next time, maybe on Wednesday. But anyway, clearly in order to make this fetch call, you got to pass it with some data. So I'm gonna go back, and inside of this fetch call, let's try to make a request to our local host, localhost 8000 slash API. And then the way that the fetch call works is that it takes its first try at calling the route, right? And then it responds with these promises, which are asynchronous blocks of code that basically resolve over time. So one thing you'll see people do pretty often when they're working with asynchronous code is you'll see a bunch of chained methods to those asynchronous codes. So for fetch, right, typically what you'll see people do is a chain a dot then method on it, which basically gets called when this first method resolves. We'll talk about some other alternatives to how people write these types of asynchronous operations, but for now, because I don't want to jump into too much stuff, I'll just keep it simple for where it is. When you make a fetch request, it comes back with a response. So in this .then method, right, we can actually make use of that response as some data, right? So here I'm just going to say response, and then I'll just say res for now. And this response, right, I need to pass another callback function for the .then to work. So what I'll do is here, create another callback function. And what I'll do is just console log the response, right? So if this comes back and it's successful, then this dot then should work. But if it comes back and there's an error, that's when we'll use a dot catch to catch the error in order to make sure that we can very clearly log that error. So I'm just gonna put this error here to catch the error and just say console.log the error. So if things work out, we'll get a console log with the response. If it doesn't work out, we're gonna get this error, right? The way that the use effect hook works is it calls whatever it needs to call in the case that some data changes, or you can specify that you want it to call it whenever the component first kind of loads by just putting an empty array in here to say, hey, I just want this to run as often as it can. So by having this now, I can perform this fetch request when our app first loads. So let's save this. Our component is going to reload. I'm going to go back to our client side app and just inspect it for now and take a look at the console in order to see what's going to happen here. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the console and connection with you. In order to have this work, I need to make sure that our server is running. So that's important. So I'm just gonna open a new terminal, and in the new terminal for the project, make sure I start our server. So just npm start the server. All right, so that's working. So I'll just refresh this and then go back to the console and see what happens. All right, all righty. Look at us, y'all. We did it. We got our first CORS error.
Yeah.
So this is what I'm talking about when we talk about CORS issues, right? So access to fetch at localhost 8000/API from origin localhost 3000 has been blocked by the CORS policy. No access control allow origin headers present on the requested resource. If you've ever dealt with server-side stuff and you've built routes before, you're gonna you'd be real familiar with this error because we get CORS errors pretty much all the time until you set up your servers. You set up the server code in order to make it so that it can be CORS compliant. And there's a couple ways to do that. So I just wanted to show you this so you saw the error that comes up when you're working with servers and trying to make these requests. So clearly we did what we needed to do because we were trying to make this request in here, but we got an error, and the error is related to CORS, and it's basically telling us we're not able to make that connection to our server. So on Wednesday and maybe next week, depending on time, we'll talk about all of the different things we can do to resolve CORS errors on our server side. But there's something that we can do on our client side right now, just as we're developing, in order to make it so that we can get rid of this CORS issue real quick so that we can just continue to work in our development environment. And what that is by utilizing what's called a proxy server in React and Create React App. One of the cool things that Create React App does is it allows for us to essentially tell React that we want it to launch launch code that will allow it to be seen as a proxy server for our API server. What that basically means, a proxy is basically just a kind of middleman server between our client and our server that we tell the React code, hey, we want you to act as if you're on port blah, 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 or at what's something domain. And in development, it can do this so that it can act as though it is on the same origin as the server. Now, this only works for us in development, but it's helpful for us right now because we're still in development, right? We're not in production yet, which is good. In production, a lot of these errors that we get in CORS, we have to resolve on the server side and in the request that we make from the client. And we'll talk about that in the future. But for now, because we're still in development mode, let's work on just kind of creating a proxy server so that we can get rid of this CORS error at least for now, so that we can send the data from our server to our client. So all you got to do in order to create that proxy server and create React app is to go to the package.json for create React app, right? So this is the package.json that got created with the create React app script. And then scroll to the bottom of the package.json and whoops, my bad. Oh, sorry. So right after, you don't necessarily need it to be at the bottom. You can add it really anywhere in this package.json, so long as it doesn't conflict with an existing kind of something scope, right? So I can also put it up here so that it's easier to see. So right before the scripts, I'm just going to go ahead and add a new line in here. I'm just going to say proxy. And then the proxy takes in a string, and this is where I had this little small bug last time. I don't know if y'all remember, but basically the proxy takes in the URL that you want the server to pretend to be hosted on, right? So for us, because our server is at localhost 8000, we want this to be mocking up proxy at that same origin so that we can get around the CORS issues that we have right now. So what I'm going to do is in the proxy, I'm just going to say HTTP : localhost 8000. Dope. So this means that when React runs, right, it's going to run on with this proxy. So it's going to run in a way that makes it seem as though it is hosted at this location, which will help us in getting around some of those CORS issues. But one of the changes we have to make in order to have this be the case is now that we're working off of that assumption that we're on localhost 8000, we can get rid of this pretext to just say we want to fetch /API so that we can get that particular data at that particular route. So I'm gonna save this. I'm pretty sure I gotta restart the server, but let's see. Oh, no, I didn't. So here, as you can see, right, we're getting this response back, and the response is coming back. This is the response that we just asked in our fetch call to console log. So now, as you can see, we're actually succeeding in making our fetch request, and we're getting that data, console log data back. So status code 200, clearly is, you can see that we are, despite the fact that we're using a proxy, clearly the URL still is tied to our React application, but this is why the proxy is helpful, because it allows for us to get around those CORS issues in development while we're building out this logic in our front end. So cool. So that's great. That means now we actually have the ability to make to continue to make our server requests to our we can continue to make our server requests. So now that we have the response coming back from now that we have the response coming back from our fetch request, right? So we did the .then first to get the response. There's another method we want to do in order to make sure that we turn that response into JSON, because remember that data, there's some JSON data that's in there, right? So another thing you'll see is after the first .then that folks chain to get the response, they'll take a second .then to basically create the data that is coming back from that's going to come back from my bad. Basically, instead of just console logging the response, right? We're going to want to essentially turn that response into JSON data, get the data from this response that we made, right? And so to do that, we're going to call a method on the response called we're going to call a method on the response to turn the data into JSON. So we're going to say res.json, which is essentially a method that gets called. And we're actually going to return this because we want this function to say, hey, once we get back the response, just return response.json. This method, response.json, also is an asynchronous method, which we'll talk a lot more about in our next session. But because this is an asynchronous method as well, that's why we chain another .then onto it to say, hey, when that method resolves, right, then we're going to get back the data that comes from there. And in that case, we'll hope that that data is actually just the data, our JSON data. So I'll open up this. And the .catch now is going to catch either of these .then. So if these two .thens work and are not unsuccessful, they will return an error, and the error is being caught here. So we'll talk about this syntax of catching and chaining these asynchronous methods and stuff. These are things that we're going to have to talk about now that we're getting into some more asynchronous and backend focused programming. But just to wrap this up so we can see our data kind of coming full circle, right? After we do this res.json, now we have this .then with some data. So I'm just going to console log the data. And then let's just take a look at that in the console on the browser. Make sure it's saved. I think it's saved, it just is taking forever. Fetch, return our res.json. Let's see, maybe I didn't need to put that return in there. No. So we're fetching the data on our API, get our res.json. Then we're supposed to get our data back and console log our data. What am I missing here that's getting this error? I hate that I do this. I hate that it happens right at the end. You know what I'm saying? It always things just wanna chop me down a little bit. You know what I'm saying? Chop me down. So let me take a look. What might I be doing wrong? Let me just refactor this a little bit so that I can just make sure I'm not doing something wrong syntactically. Okay. And unexpected token is not valid JSON. So let me just take a look at the server and make sure that I didn't make any simple mistakes there. I don't think so. Yeah, res.json, yo from the server. We already knew that that was working. And then here in our app, we're making the fetch call to our /API. We got back the response. Matter of fact, let me just get rid of this real quick to just make sure that we're still getting back that response. Okay. So let me do one thing first and I just want to stop the client server just in case I need to relaunch it. So let me just relaunch that real quick. And regardless of what's going on, I'll finish up the code so that we have it, and then I'll tack on whatever my debug is that I gotta do. Okay, so this is still loading because this didn't start yet. All right, I'm just waiting for the client to reload on this side and then take a look at the logs. Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's just something on my side is tweaking. Yeah, I appreciate that. That's good to know. Yeah, it shouldn't be any errors. I don't know. Maybe it's because things are not working well on my computer real quick. But yeah, you shouldn't have any errors if you're following up to now, right? We had the chain the dot then to get the data back from our yeah, I think things are just kind of lagging on my side. We basically, first we got the JSON data, we got the response back, we called the .json to turn that data to JSON data. Then when that data resolves, right, we'll be able to work with it and do whatever we want to it, right? In this case, I kind of console logged, but what I would rather do, and this is literally the last step I was gonna do, right, is I'd rather set the state with this data so that I can make use of it inside of this component, right? So to do that, I'm just gonna add a use state into our component real quick. And at the start of the component, I'm just gonna create a new state. I'm just gonna call it message, set message here. And I'm gonna default it to say, we're gonna default it to say, to just kind of be null for now, because there's no data there. And then here, where we have this kind of paragraph coming back, I'm just gonna change this to be some JavaScript code, and I'm just gonna say message, and basically create an expression to test whether the message is there. If we have a message, if this is true, then we're gonna put the message. Otherwise, we're gonna say loading. And I'll just put this in some quotes. This basically is using some conditional rendering to basically say, hey, if we have a message as in our state, then we can return the message. Otherwise, we're just gonna return this string called loading that says loading. And now when we get back the data, instead of just console logging, what I wanna do is I want to actually set the state so that we can pass that data into the state. So to do that, what we're gonna do is we're just gonna open this up a little bit and then set message with the data. So now when we get that data back, right, we're gonna set the state with that information, and the data will be here. So actually, I remember now that we have the message from our server. I think we defined it as an object. Oh, it's message.message. So that's a little that's a little OD. So what I'm going to do is just change the state data to just be data instead of message. So up top here, instead of calling this state message, or you know what I can do is here where I set the message, I could just say data.message. That way I set it to be from the data. So cool. So I'm gonna save this. Hopefully my drawing isn't tweaking, but this is literally what we needed to do, right? Get the data back as JSON, get the data and set the state with that data. And now that we have our code working with some conditional logic, right? Now that our code is working with some conditional logic, whoops, I'm sorry, I keep scrolling past them. Now that our code is working with some conditional logic here on line 27, we're basically going to allow our component to update if the data updates. But now I don't need this message.data because we already got it. We already got it figured out here. So I got that. So now this code should be able to change and boom. Okay, so it is working. Yo-yo from the server. Oh, thank God, because I go flip it. So cool. So clearly we're getting this data back from the server, which is perfect. And that's great. The last thing I want to do just to wrap up talking about the server and how all of this kind of works, right? Now that we have some data coming back from our, server and whatnot, right? We're in a good place to kind of finalize this application. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop the client for now. So just go back to the terminal and just stop the client. Clearly the server is still running here. And so what I want to do is just to show y'all, if I wanted to essentially host this code from the server, which is something that we typically like to do. So now that the client is built and we kind of feel good about it, right? Typically, we don't keep using the React development server, right? We will move on to utilizing a actual server to host our React code. And we actually have a server that can do that. The only thing we need to do is we need to add 2 lines to our server code so that we can send back the React build for our React application from the server. And then we have to make a build of our React code. So we'll talk about those 3 things real quick. So underneath the Express import, I'm just going to add one last import, and I'm just going to say import path module. And the path module is just a package that allows us to utilize information about paths. So I'm just going to require in path like this. And now after we create our application, we just wanted to host the files, the static files for our React application. So we're going to say host React app as static files. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use one of those express lines that we talked about toward the beginning, which essentially will allow for me to host this application, host some static files, right? So the static files I'm going to use, I'm just going to write this script real quick just for time, and then we can talk through it, right, real quick. So app.use, so we're going to use express.static, which is the function that allows us to define some resources to be hosted on our server. So I'm going to do path.resolve, and inside of here we pass this kind of funky syntax, but this is what it kind of will look like at the end. So we'll pass a folder. So we're basically saying, hey, I'm going to have a directory called build, and inside of that directory, I want you to host all of the files inside of that directory as public files. And so, so now, right, if anybody goes to any of those files, they should be hosted live on our server. So the last thing I want to do is add a route in here for, instead of just sending, hey, don't forget we're testing the API here, I'm going to say res.send file, and we're going to actually send back an HTML file. And that file is going to be the file that is inside of our React application that we use to create our React application in the first place. So I'm just going to do this real quick. So we're going into that static folder that we just defined, and we're just kind of saying, hey, there's a path, here's a path to a particular file that I want to host. It's the index.html file that comes back when we build our React application. So this now, whenever someone goes to this route, it will attempt to find and send this file. But in order for this to work, we need to make sure that that file exists. So the last thing that I need to do in order to wrap this full stack app up is I'll go back into the client terminal, right? And I'm just gonna run npm run build like you see here to create a production build of our code base. What this does is it compiles down all of the React code that we have in our current client folder into a couple files that we can host statically. So I'm going to do npm run build. And this is basically the last step you do when you're ready for production. When you're saying, hey, now I'm getting this code ready to be put onto a server, to be hosted somewhere so someone can see my projects, right? You build your React code. This build just kind of runs to some scripts. And as you can see, it creates this build folder for us, right? And that build folder is essentially what we were telling the server up here that we wanted it to host for us. So we kind of did the server step first, but now after this script finishes running, we'll have a solid package of all of our React code that is ready to go. So now whenever that build finishes running, we'll be able to then run these routes and pass back the actual index.html files, etc., that are going to be contained in there. So I'm just going to save this for right now. Y'all know the vibes. My computer going to take a second to run this build. But once it finishes, we'll have inside of this build folder, as it's kind of going, some files relevant to our finished React application. And that is all we got to do in order to start hosting our React app on our server. And so, yeah, I'll give it a couple minutes. Y'all can feel free to hang around to see it when I finish it. Or otherwise, you can slide, which is all cool. But I'll hang around, see it go. I think it's finishing up. All right, so dope. So it finished up the build. And inside of this folder, if we open it up, you can see there's an index.html file in here, and there's a couple of static JavaScript files that were created as well. So now that all of that build is complete, we actually can now host our code through our server, which is what we're doing on line 14, is saying, hey, we're going to host those files. But then on line 18, we're sending back the index.html file that is located in this build folder. And now for the moment of truth, I'm going to just stop the server and then run it one more time, npm start. And inside now, we don't care about localhost 3000 anymore. We'll go back to localhost 8000 and make sure that the port is running. So once it says that it's good, okay, the server is running. So now, right, if we go to /API, we would expect that we still see our message there. If we go back to our root route though, right, now we get our React app popping up. So what's happening now is we're serving up the React application all from the server. So now both the React app and the server are running on the same server. And so what's cool about this is now that they're hosted on the same origin, we're also getting around those CORS errors that we were talking about before. But now we have a complete React application hosted on Express. Some of that data is coming back from the server into our React application, and we kind of connected and created our first full stack app. So thanks to y'all for sticking around a couple minutes late. I know that we went a little over, but hopefully you see the value in this. And it makes an impact in your full stack journey. But yeah, you know what I'm saying? Full stack. We'll talk more about this on Wednesday for those of y'all, for the folks that didn't stick around. But for those of y'all that did, I appreciate you and appreciate your time. And